They were already saying the Norwegian would sicken before the snow was gone, for no decent man on the plains kept his cattle stabled in his own house. And here was a man building his home with a cow byre walled in under the very same roof. In the summer of 1886, on a windswept claim near a raw little settlement called Sorrel Butte in the eastern Montana Territory, Halvor Rustad raised a long, low house of logs, and then did the thing the whole country took for filth. He split that house in two with a stout log partition, and into the far end, behind that wall, he led his handful of cattle and stalled them, so the beasts and his family would winter beneath one roof tree with only a chinked log wall between them. Winter came early and mean and long to that high country, and every sensible homesteader for 20 miles had built a clean separate cabin, set an iron stove in the middle of it, and thrown up a rough shed across the yard for his stock. Here was the foreigner walling his oxen and his milk cows into the same building he meant to live in, bedding down cheek by jowl with his beasts like a peasant off the far side of the ocean. He would breed a fever in that filthy barn and bury half his household by spring, they said. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter of 1887 would teach them to their cost, was that Halvor Rustad had read the cold and the beast better than any man in Sorrel Butte, and had built into that low shared longhouse the one warmth that burned no wood and never, all winter long, went out. He had come to that country carrying old knowledge and not much else. He was a spare, weather, dark man of about 40, born and raised on a hard mountain farm on the west coast of Norway in a steep land of long winters where his people had lived, for longer than anyone could count back, in just such a house as he was building now, the longhouse, where the family kept the near end warm and the cattle kept the far, and the two shared one roof and one winter. He had grown up sleeping a wall's thickness from the breathing of the cows and thought nothing of it, for on that mountain there was no other way a poor family and its beasts both came through to spring alive. He had married a steady, capable woman named Merritt off a neighboring farm, and when the land at home grew too thin to feed the people on it, the two of them crossed an ocean and half a continent to take up a cheap quarter section in the Montana Territory, arriving in the spring with a wagon, a plow, a few head of cattle, a shaggy farm dog, and a way of thinking about warmth that not one of their new American neighbors would ever have guessed. For Halvor Rustad knew one plain thing in his bones that the whole of his strange house was built upon, and the settlers around him had never had cause to think it through, because they had always had wood and reckoned they always would. It was this, that a living animal is a furnace that never goes out. A full-grown cow or ox standing in its stall and chewing its cud gives off a steady warmth the whole day and night through, a slow, patient, living heat that pours off its great body and asks for nothing but hay. It does not flare up and die like a fire. It does not have to be fed split wood at midnight. It does not go stone cold the hour the fuel runs out. It burns hay slowly deep in the furnace of its own body, and turns it to a low, even warmth every hour of every day of the winter. Put 4 or 5 such beasts together under a low roof, and they throw off between them a heat no cabin stove could match for faithfulness, a warmth that renews itself out of the manger as fast as the cold can carry it off, and that will still be pouring off their flanks on the coldest black morning of the year, when every fire in the country has burned to dead gray ash. Halvor Rustad meant to do the one sane thing his old country had taught him, and let the two hard problems solve each other. But knowing that a beast throws off heat is one thing, and building a house that gathers it and holds it is another. The warmth of the animals was no use to a freezing family if it drifted off into the sky. And so every part of Rustad's long, low house was shaped to catch it and lead it where it was wanted. He set the byre end and the living end under one unbroken roof ridge so the warm air rising off the cattle could not escape, but gathered along the underside of the roof and slid the length of the building. He raised the heavy log partition between the two ends, close chinked to keep the beast penned and the smell back, but left it low under the ridge and fitted it with a small closable opening, so the gathered warmth could pass into the living room while the animals stayed on their own side. He banked earth and sod high against the outer walls and laid a deep loft of hay across the whole ceiling, so the house sat wrapped in its own thick blanket and the heat could not be robbed away. He set the byre on the windward end, so the bodies of the cattle and the bank of hay took the brunt of the north wind before it reached the sleeping family. And in the living end he built only a small, plain hearth, and stacked beside it only a modest rank of wood, for he did not mean that hearth to carry the house through the winter. He meant the beasts to carry it, and the hearth only to help of a morning. So it had come to Halvor Rustad in the long ship crossing and the longer wagon road west, that if he built his home the old way of his mountain, one long roof over family and cattle both, the beasts walled close at the cold end, the warm air gathered and led down the house, the whole of it banked in earth and hay, he would have a home a handful of animals would keep alive through the hardest winter, on almost no wood at all. Rustad meant to let his cattle stand as his stove, a stove that fed itself on hay, never once went out, and gave back milk and calves, and strong oxen in the bargain. It was the plainest, oldest reasoning in the world, and he had carried it across an ocean into a country that had forgotten it, and he set out that summer to build it on the corner of a Montana claim. He began, to the settlement's mild approval, by raising the shell of a long, stout house of logs, and any homesteader riding by nodded to see it, for a man building a tight house before winter was only being provident, even if the house did seem uncommonly long for one small family. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to disgust. Instead of finishing a clean single-family cabin and knocking together a separate shed across the yard, he ran a heavy log partition across the inside of his long house, closed the whole far end into a byre, and, in plain sight of anyone who cared to watch, led his oxen and his milk cows in through a door at that end and stalled them there, not 30 feet from where he and Merritt would spread their bed. He forked hay into the mangers, bedded the beasts deep in straw, hung a loft of more hay across the ceiling, and banked the sod up the outside walls until the long house looked half buried and half alive, a low steaming ridge of a thing, with cattle breathing at one end and a thin thread of chimney smoke at the other. From the road it looked exactly like what the settlement said it was, a filthy foreign hovel where a man too backward to know better had moved into the barn with his cows. The disgust grew with every load of hay he forked and every shovel of muck he carried out, and Halvor Rustad, who had slept a wall from the cattle his whole life, let them talk. The work of keeping such a house was long and constant and not clean, and that made the mockery worse, for to the people of Sorrel Butte the whole thing was an offense to every notion they held of how a decent family ought to live. All winter a byre dwelling had to be mucked out and freshly bedded, the beasts fed and watered morning and night. and the near end could never be got wholly free of the warm animal smell of the far, and the settlement settled it plainly, the Norwegian lived in filth like the peasant they were sure he was. When a neighbor told him flatly that no self-respecting man in this country stabled cattle in his own house, that it was low and foreign and filthy, Halvor answered, in his slow, careful English, that a fire went out but a cow did not, and that come the worst of the winter they would see which of them had built the warmer house, and the neighbor rode off certain the foreigner was as backward as the whole settlement had always said. Halvor Rustad knew exactly why he had walled his beasts in under his own roof, and there was not another soul in Sorrel Butte willing to see the sense of it. The mockery had a leader, and his name was Emmett Crane. Crane was a cattleman grown prosperous in the great open-range boom of those years, a big, hearty, loud-voiced man who ran the most stock of anyone near Sorrel Butte, held a fine 2-story frame house above the creek, and liked everyone to know that a man got on in this world by doing things the modern, forward, American way. Like every cattleman of that flush and confident time, Crane wintered his great herd out on the open range, turning them loose to fend for themselves, trusting to the Chinook and the open country. He had watched the Norwegian raise a long log house and grunted his approval. Then he had watched the man wall his cattle into the end of it and move in alongside them. And something in Crane took the sight as a personal affront. So Crane led the laughter, and did it with a cattleman's carrying voice. He would stand on his porch and remark that the Norseman had stabled his stock in his own parlour, that Rustad and his cows would all be dead of the filth by spring, and that this was what came of letting the scrapings of the old country take up good American land. And the men would laugh, and it went round the country, Rustad, the foreigner who lived with his cattle, wintering in the dirt and reek of his beasts. Halvor let them talk, for a settlement busy laughing leaves a man alone to work, and there was much still to do that none of them would have understood. He hung a plank door in the low pass between the byre and the living end, and fitted it to swing shut, so on the bitterest nights he could close the beast's warmth in close about the family, and swing it open by day to let their heat spread down the house. He bedded the animals deep, for dry, well-bedded, sheltered beasts stay warm and eat little while cold. Neglected ones burn through their fodder and give back nothing, so his hay, like the wood he was not burning, would last the winter out. And in the living end he laid up only that small hearth and a short rank of wood, a fraction of the great cords the other men were splitting all autumn, for the wood was meant only to take the morning chill off and boil the coffee. The long work of holding the house against 40 and 50 below he had given, deliberately, to the breathing beast behind the wall. The men who watched him fuss over a low door and a bank of sod were surer than ever the foreigner had no notion of how to live in a civilized country. What the folks who drove past Rustad's low half-buried long house of a Sunday were laughing at, and could not see, was as sound a piece of cold country reasoning as the territory had ever held. Every stove in that country roared hot of an evening and stood dead cold by the small hours, and every open-range herd stood loose on the winter grass with no shelter but a coulee bank. Halvor Rustad's long house answered both follies at a single stroke. The beasts other men left out to freeze he had brought in under his roof, where their steady living heat, renewing itself hour by hour out of the manger, poured over the low partition and held the whole house warm through the deadest, most fireless hour of the night, and in return, the house that warmed his family kept his cattle alive and fed and out of the wind. It was 2 winters' worth of trouble solved with one long roof, and the whole of Sorrel Butte drove past of a Sunday to laugh at it. By the middle of November, the country began to turn hard, and Halvor Rustad got his first real proof, though he was near the only man who marked it. A savage cold snap came down off the plains one night, the first true one of the season. The temperature falling far below zero, and the wind out of the north, driving the frost deep into everything. In the gray of the morning, the homesteaders up and down the settlement woke to misery. Their stoves, fed until midnight, had burned out in the small hours and gone dead cold, and the frost had come into the rooms behind them and stripped the warmth away. So their clean, decent cabins were bitter, though the fire had roared the evening before, and every family rose shivering to build the fire again from cold ash with fingers that would barely close. Out in the sheds and coulees their cattle stood humped against the killing wind, and here and there a weak beast had gone down in the night and did not get up. That was the plain price of the modern way in a hard, cold snap, and every homesteader paid it. Halvor Rustad did not. He woke in the near end of his long house to a room that was not cold, cool, but living, holding a low, steady warmth, with no fire lit since the evening before, and lay listening to the beasts stir and breathe behind the partition, the warmth of them coming steady over the low wall as it had all night. He rose and laid a bare hand flat against the log partition, and it was warm. Warm with the banked heat of the byre beyond, and his cattle stood behind it dry and easy and chewing in the dark, not one the worse for the night that had thrown his neighbor's stock down in the open. His family had slept warm, and he had burned not a stick of wood to do it. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Halvor Rustad had lived in it since the day he drove the first nail, doubled by the deeper loneliness of the far-come stranger who speaks the language slowly and is laughed at in it. On the clear, hard nights of that late autumn, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead, he would sit in the warm near end with the fire dead in the hearth and the cattle breathing beyond the wall, and go back over the whole of it the way a man checks a sum he has staked his family's lives upon. There was no book for what he had built, and no neighbor who would grant it a grain of sense. There was only the plain old knowledge of his mountain, that a beast under the roof is a fire that feeds itself, that hay in the manger is warmth in the house, and on the cold nights that knowledge was the only voice in Sorrel Butte that agreed with him. Everyone he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing that a man keeps warm by a stove and a woodpile and keeps his beasts at a decent, filthy distance. The quiet thing about the steady self-renewing warmth of the penned animals, only he believed, and he had decided long before, on the far side of an ocean, which of the two he would trust when they disagreed, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the frost cracked the logs outside. He told no one, for there was no one who would have believed him, and besides, Halvor Rustad had never needed the settlement to agree before a thing was true. He laid in his hay, cut his modest rank of stove wood, saw to the chinking of the byre wall and the banking of the sod, and settled in with Merritt and the beasts and the dog to wait for the winter he had spent his whole life getting ready for. In a low, warm house the whole country was certain would be the death of him. The settlement settled in too, its cordwood stacked high, its cattle turned loose on the range, its opinion of the Norwegian fixed. He was the backward foreigner who had moved in with his cows, and when the killing cold came, they expected, in the way people expect such things without quite wishing them, to hear that a fever had gone through that filthy long barn and carried off half of what slept in it. The killing cold came in the last days of January, and it did not come alone. It came as the very heart of the worst winter the northern plains had ever shown to living men, the winter that broke the great open-range cattle business for good and was spoken of for 40 years after as the winter that emptied the ranges. It began with a wind out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 50 degrees between noon and dark, and then it began to snow. And the snow did not stop. For 11 days the blizzard held the territory in its fist. The wind blew without pause, packing the snow into iron drifts that swallowed the fences and buried the low sheds and cut Sorrel Butte off from everything but its own hard endurance. Out on the open range the great herds drifted helpless before the wind, unable to reach the grass under the frozen crust, and died in their thousands against the drift lines and coulee banks, whole fortunes freezing and starving where they stood. The thermometer nailed to the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and did not come back. It passed 20 below. It passed 30 below. It passed 40. And on the coldest black morning of that terrible stretch, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 46 degrees below zero, and he had never in his life seen it fall so far, and did not go out of his way to tell the few who were about, for he did not think a number like that would help anyone bear it. 46 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a plains winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to give no heat at all against a cold so vast. The homesteaders of Sorrel Butte, who had done the clean and decent and modern thing and set good iron stoves in their good separate cabins, found now what the modern way was worth at 46 below, that a stove at such a cold had to be fed without a single pause, or the frost took the room back in half an hour, driving straight through the log walls no matter how the iron roared, and that no woodpile, however high a man had stacked it in the golden autumn, stood high enough. They kept their fires roaring and wore their coats indoors and sat up in shifts through the endless nights to feed the stove, and watched their great cordwood piles shrink with a growing and private fear. And the storm did not stop, and the thermometer did not rise, and the wood burned down. And out on the range, past all helping now, their cattle, and Emmett Crane's great proud herd with them, died and went on dying, until the drifts of that winter were said, come the spring thaw, to be marked out by the long dark lines of the dead. In the long, low house, half buried in the drifts, the filthy foreign buyer dwelling the whole country had laughed at, Halvor Rustad and his family were warm. They were not roasting. The near end was not hot, but it was warm, steadily and quietly and unmistakably warm, and it held through the first day of the storm and the second and the third, and did not fail. And through all of it Halvor lit only the smallest handful of a fire in the little hearth of a morning, to boil the coffee and take the last chill off, and let it die by noon, and the house stayed warm without it. For behind the log partition 4 and 5 great beasts stood breathing in the close, deep-bedded dark, giving off their steady, patient, living heat hour upon hour, day upon day, exactly as they had been built into that house to do, burning the hay in the mangers slowly in their great bodies and turning it to a low, even warmth that rose off their flanks and slid over the low partition and filled. The living end renewing itself as fast as the terrible cold could carry it away. The frost that stripped the neighbors' cabins bare the moment their fires died could find no fire of Halvor's to kill, his warmth came off the living bodies of penned animals that did not go out at all. The storm gave him no reason to trust it and every reason to doubt, and still the living warmth held. The wind threw itself at the long log walls without pause, and the snow packed a great white bank up the windward byre wall that only helped to hold the warmth in. Halvor Rustad's days through that killing stretch were given over wholly to the beasts, and in tending them he was tending his own family's lives. Morning and night he forked down hay and carried water and mucked the stalls and bedded the animals fresh and deep, keeping them dry and fed and easy, for content, well-kept beasts throw the most heat and eat the least, and every hour they stood warm behind the partition was an hour his family did not freeze. The long house was, against all the reason the settlement believed in, a living warm place in the dead middle of the worst winter the plains had ever thrown, while a single stride beyond the sod-banked wall the cold stood ready to kill a man in an hour. Halvor Rustad had carried a small thermometer out of the old country and hung it by the door of the living end, and on the coldest black morning of the storm. The morning the store glass across the buried flat stood at 46 below, he rose from the warm bed he shared with Merritt and looked at it in the gray dark. The needle inside his longhouse stood at 38 degrees above zero. 38 above. Not warm as a summer parlor is warm, but warm as a well-kept byre is warm on a winter dawn. Warm enough that the water stood liquid in the pail, and his hands were sure, and Merritt slept easy, and not a soul under his roof was any nearer freezing than in the mild days of October, and his little hearth stood dead and black and cold, not a stick burning, not a coal alive, for he had let the morning fire die hours since, and the house had never felt the want of it. 38 above inside, against 46 below without. A gulf of 84 degrees held across log walls and a bank of sod and a loft of hay, with no fire lit at all, in the worst blizzard the territory had ever shown, held up by nothing in this world but the steady breathing warmth of a handful of cattle stalled behind a log wall. Halvor stood a while looking at the needle, then laid the flat of his bare hand against the warm logs of the partition, and beyond them he could hear the beasts stir and chew in the dark, pouring out the heat that kept every living thing in that house alive. And he went and forked the cattle their hay. For that, and not any fire, was the true feeding that kept his house. Up on the good land above the creek, the reckoning had come to Emmett Crane. His great proud herd, the most stock in the country, turned loose on the open range in the easy confidence of the boom, was dying out there in the drifts by the hundred, and there was not one thing on earth he could do to stop it, and his fine frame house, all clean milled lumber and tall rooms and honest iron stoves, drank cordwood at 46 below the way a big drafty house does, and along about the 9th day of the storm, with the range a graveyard and his woodpile burned alarmingly low and his stoves for the first time going gray between the feedings, the big, loud, forward-looking man understood that he was in real danger, and that the nearest safe warmth in that white and screaming world was in the filthy foreign hovel he had mocked all autumn from his porch. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold had got a killing edge inside his own fine rooms, then wrapped himself in every hide he owned and put his head down into the wind and fought his way across the buried flat to the Norwegian's long, low house, half frozen and not sure the man would even open to him. He came up under the low sod-banked eave and beat on the plank door with a numb fist, and it opened, and warmth rolled out over him into the storm like something solid, and with it the warm, living smell of the beasts. Emmett Crane stood in the low doorway and could not speak at first, and it was not only the cold that stopped his mouth. He stepped down onto the packed earth floor of the warm living end and felt the heat of the place stand steady all around him. A living, breathing warmth such as he had not felt in his own grand house in a week, and he looked about for the great roaring stove that surely must be making it, and found instead a small plain hearth standing dead and cold and black, not a flame nor a coal alive in it. Then, over the low partition at the far end, he heard the slow breathing of the cattle, and felt the warmth pouring off that wall into the room, and understood at last, standing there, thawing in the filthy foreign hovel, what he had been laughing at all autumn long. He walked the length of the house and looked over the partition, and there in the deep-bedded dark stood the Norwegian's cattle, every one alive and dry and easy and fat, chewing their hay in the warmth of their own breathing, while his own great herd lay frozen in the drifts a mile away. And he laid his numb hand on the warm logs and felt the banked heat of the beasts come steady into his palm, and looked at the thermometer by the door reading 38 above, while the world outside stood at 46 below. And Emmett Crane, cattleman, leader of all the mockery, took off his frozen hat. He was quiet a while. Then he said the only thing there was to say. "You kept them under your roof," he said, slow, "and they kept you." Halvor Rustad said that they had. And Crane, with the painful thawing coming into his hands, said lower that he had been a fool about the foreigner and the beasts both, and had said hard things he had no business saying, and Halvor Rustad, who had no gloating in him, only told him to come into the warm end and shut the door, and stop letting the good heat out. He kept Emmett Crane through the last days of the storm, and 2 other men besides, who came fighting down the buried road once word got round that there was warmth in the Norwegian's long house. And the low living end, built for one small family, held them all, and stayed warm through the whole of it on almost no wood at all, because the warmth was not in any fire, but in the steady living heat of the beasts behind the wall, that fed on hay and never went out. When the wind finally broke on the 12th day and a hard, blinding sun came up over a white and ruined country, the men who walked out of Halvor Rustad's byre dwelling walked out warm and whole into a territory that had lost, in that one winter, the better part of every herd on the northern range, and hard men who had laughed all autumn did not laugh about the filthy foreign longhouse any more. Emmett Crane least of all. He went home to a cold grand house, and a rain strewn with the frozen wreck of his fortune a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, he came back down to the long low house and asked Halvor Rustad to show him how the thing was built, the partition and the low pass, and the banked sod, and the beasts stalled warm under the family's own roof, and Halvor Rustad showed him. Word of the warm longhouse got around the country that spring the way the mockery had got around the autumn before, only slower and more thoughtful, for the winter of 1887 had cured a great many men of a great many certainties. Some few of the settlers, the poorer and the humbler, and the ones who had come nearest to freezing, swallowed their pride and built themselves byre dwellings on the Norwegian's plan, and blessed them ever after through the winters that followed. Most did not. Most would rather stack a high woodpile and keep their beasts at a clean, cold distance and take their chances than move into the barn like a foreigner, for a man's pride in how he lives runs deeper than his memory of one bad winter. But the ones who built them lived warmer and lost fewer cattle for the rest of their lives. And the story of the winter of the great die-up, the winter of 46 below, when the open range herds froze in their thousands, and the proud modern men very nearly froze along with them, and the backward foreigner who kept his cows in his house came through warm with every soul and every beast alive, was told around Sorrel Butte for as long as there was a Sorrel Butte to tell it. They had called him filthy and backward for keeping his beasts under his own roof, while wiser, cleaner, more modern men built proper houses and proper barns and turned their great herds loose on the open range, and in a way the wiser men had looked the wiser, right up until the cold asked its real question. For a killing winter does not care how clean a man keeps his house, or how modern his ways, nor how bright a stove roars of an evening, or how high the woodpile was stacked in the golden autumn. It asks only whether there will still be a living warmth in the house in the dead black middle of the night when the fire has burned to nothing and the wood is gone, and the heat of an iron stove, however fine, will not answer. Halvor Rustad had built his answer out of the oldest and humblest knowledge his poor mountain country had, that a beast under the roof is a stove that feeds itself, that hay in the manger is warmth that never goes out, that the low-shared longhouse the new country scorned was the surest shelter a cold land ever knew. And when the great killing winter came down at last and asked its question, his answer was already there, breathing warm behind a log wall, and it held. As the old folk of his mountain used to say, of the cow that carries a poor house through the black months on nothing but hay, the fire you feed with your own two hands will fail you in the end, but the warmth that feeds itself is never cold. Halvor Rustad had built his house around a warmth that fed itself, and on the morning it fell to 46 below, the slow, steady breathing of the beasts behind the wall never once let the winter in.